You know that feeling when you're lying in bed at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying some decision you made earlier that day and thinking to yourself, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? Maybe it was sending that text message you knew you shouldn't have sent. Maybe it was buying something you absolutely didn't need but convinced yourself you desperately wanted in that moment. Maybe it was saying yes to something when every fiber of your being was screaming no, or staying silent when you should have spoken up, or speaking up when silence would have served you better. We've all been there, haven't we? In that quiet, brutal space where hindsight is crystalline and regret tastes like copper on your tongue. And in those moments, we tend to be pretty harsh on ourselves. We call ourselves idiots. We wonder why we can't just make better choices. We promise ourselves that next time will be different, that we'll be smarter, more rational, more in control. But here's the thing that nobody really talks about, the thing that might actually make you feel a little better or possibly a lot worse, depending on how you look at it. Your mind isn't making stupid decisions by accident. It's not malfunctioning. It's not broken. In fact, your mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do, following ancient programming that's kept our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years. The problem is that the world your mind was built for doesn't exist anymore, and the shortcuts it takes, the patterns it follows, the decisions it pushes you toward, they made perfect sense in a completely different reality. But in this reality, in your reality, right here, right now, those same mechanisms can make you look absolutely ridiculous. Let me tell you about a man who understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and if you've heard of him at all, you probably think of him as that cynical Renaissance guy who wrote about how leaders should be willing to do terrible things to maintain power, the man whose name became synonymous with manipulation and ruthlessness. But that surface-level understanding of Machiavelli misses something profound, something that makes his work relevant 500 years after he wrote it. Machiavelli wasn't just studying politics. He was studying human nature itself, the machinery of decision-making, the way people consistently choose paths that lead them directly into disaster while believing wholeheartedly that they're being perfectly reasonable. He watched intelligent, educated, powerful people make catastrophically stupid decisions over and over again, and he became obsessed with understanding why. And what he discovered, what he documented with almost clinical precision, was that human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures who convince themselves they're being rational, and that this self-deception is so deeply woven into how we think that we can barely see it happening even when someone points it right at us. In 1512, Machiavelli's world collapsed. He'd been a senior official in the Florentine Republic, a diplomat and political advisor, someone who walked the halls of power and watched history being made from the inside. And then, in one brutal political shift, he lost everything. He was arrested, tortured, exiled from the city he loved, stripped of his position and his purpose. He ended up in a small villa outside Florence, banned from politics, banned from the city itself, essentially erased from the world he'd inhabited. And in that exile, in that forced stillness, he started writing. He wrote letters to friends about how he'd spend his days dealing with peasants and woodcutters, people he found boring and beneath his intellectual station, and then how every evening he'd wash himself, put on his finest clothes, the robes he used to wear to court, and enter his study to commune with the great minds of antiquity through their books. He'd read philosophy and history, and he'd argue with these long-dead thinkers, asking them questions, wrestling with ideas, trying to understand the pattern he'd seen throughout his career, this pattern of human stupidity that seemed to be the driving force of history itself. Out of that obsession came The Prince, the book that would make him infamous, but also to discourses on Livy and the Art of War and several other works that all circled around the same core question: why do people, especially people with power and intelligence and resources, make such consistently terrible choices? And what Machiavelli concluded, what he documented with example after example from history and from his own experience, was that human beings are fundamentally driven by forces they don't understand and can't control, and they make up rational-sounding stories afterward to explain decisions that were never rational in the first place. He saw that we're predictably irrational, that our irrationality follows patterns, and that if you understand those patterns, you can predict what people will do with startling accuracy. He was describing cognitive biases 500 years before psychology gave them names, mapping out the territory of human decision-making in a way that still feels uncomfortably accurate today. Let's start with something Machiavelli observed constantly in the leaders he advised and studied: the inability to see danger until it's too late. He wrote about how people tend to ignore problems when they're small and manageable, how they'll convince themselves that everything is fine, that the warning signs don't mean what they obviously mean, and then they'll act surprised when the crisis they could have prevented explodes in their faces. He compared it to a disease that physicians of his time knew well, a particular fever that was easy to diagnose but hard to cure if you caught it early, and impossible to diagnose but easy to cure if you waited. Leaders, he said, do this constantly. They wait. They hope the problem will resolve itself. They minimize. They rationalize. And by the time they're forced to acknowledge reality, their options have narrowed to a set of terrible choices, any of which will hurt. Now think about your own life for a moment. Think about that relationship that you knew wasn't working, that you could feel dying slowly, but instead of addressing it directly, instead of having the hard conversation when it might have made a difference, you convinced yourself it would get better. You told yourself you were being patient, being understanding, giving it time. And you waited, and it got worse, and by the time you couldn't ignore it anymore, the damage was so deep that the relationship ended messily, painfully, in a way that hurt everyone involved far more than it needed to. Or think about your health, that persistent pain or symptom that you've been ignoring because acknowledging it would mean doctors and tests and potentially scary news, so instead you've constructed an elaborate story about how it's probably nothing, how it'll go away on its own, how you're too busy to deal with it right now. Or your finances, the credit card debt creeping up month after month while you tell yourself you'll get serious about it later, after this expense or that emergency, not quite doing the math on where this trajectory leads because doing that math would require changing your behavior right now, today, and that feels impossible. This is what Machiavelli was talking about. This pattern he saw in princes and generals and city-states plays out in your life constantly, at every scale. Your mind has a spectacular ability to not see what it doesn't want to see, to construct elaborate justifications for inaction, to convince you that the future will somehow be different even though you're not changing anything in the present. And the really maddening part is that you're not stupid. You're not ignorant. On some level, you know exactly what you're doing. But that knowledge doesn't translate into different behavior because the forces pushing you toward denial and delay are so much more powerful than your abstract understanding of what you should do. Machiavelli understood that human beings are governed by what he called passions, powerful emotional drives that override reason more often than not. Fear, desire, pride, anger, these aren't minor influences on our thinking. They are our thinking, at least in the moments when we're actually making decisions. We like to believe we're rational creatures who occasionally feel emotions, but Machiavelli saw it the other way around. We're emotional creatures who occasionally use reason to justify what we've already decided we want to do. And once you start seeing this pattern, once you start noticing it in yourself and others, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere. It's constant. It's who we are. Here's another thing Machiavelli noticed: people are terrible at learning from experience, especially from success. He wrote about how victory makes people stupid, how when things are going well, we convince ourselves that we're brilliant, that we've figured something out, that our success is the result of our wisdom and skill rather than luck or circumstance. And this confidence, this certainty that we know what we're doing, makes us rigid. It makes us unable to adapt when conditions change. We keep doing what worked before, even when it's clearly not working anymore, because our identity has become wrapped up in the story of our competence. Admitting that circumstances have changed, that our previous approach is no longer valid, feels like admitting that we were never as smart as we thought we were, and that's psychologically intolerable. So instead, we double down. We do more of what worked before, harder, with more conviction, and we're genuinely confused when reality doesn't cooperate. You see this in companies that become successful doing one thing and then get disrupted because they can't imagine doing anything different. You see it in athletes who keep training the same way even as their bodies age and their results decline. You see it in relationships where the dynamics that worked in the beginning become toxic later, but both people keep playing the same roles because it's what they know. And you see it in yourself, don't you? That job search strategy that worked once but isn't working now, that communication style that used to be effective but lately seems to create conflict, that way of managing stress or organizing your time that used to keep you afloat but now leaves you constantly overwhelmed. Part of you knows it's not working. But changing would mean admitting that what you've been doing, maybe what you've been doing for years, isn't right. And that admission feels dangerous. It feels like losing yourself. So you keep at it, waiting for reality to start making sense again, for the world to go back to rewarding your approach the way it used to. Machiavelli called this the problem of adaptability, and he believed it was one of the main reasons why successful people and successful states eventually fail. They become prisoners of their own success story. They can't evolve because evolution feels like betrayal of what made them who they are. And your mind does this to you constantly, locks you into patterns that used to serve you but don't anymore, and then makes changing those patterns feel like death. This rigidity, this inability to let go of what worked in the past, is one of the most predictable ways we sabotage ourselves, and we do it while feeling absolutely certain that we're being consistent, principled, true to ourselves. We mistake stubbornness for integrity, and by the time we realize our mistake, we've often lost whatever we were trying to protect. But here's where it gets really interesting, where Machiavelli's insights cut deepest. He talked extensively about how human beings fundamentally misunderstand what other people want and why they do things. We project our own desires and motivations onto others, and then we're shocked when they don't behave the way we expected. We assume that if we're kind to someone, they'll be kind back. We assume that if we're loyal, loyalty will be returned. We assume that people see us the way we see ourselves, that they understand our intentions, that they're playing by the same rules we are. And Machiavelli watched this mistake destroy people over and over. He saw generous leaders betrayed by people they trusted. He saw honest people outmaneuvered by liars who understood that honesty isn't actually a universal value. He saw idealists crushed by pragmatists who weren't bound by the same principles. This is where Machiavelli got his reputation for cynicism, because he was basically saying, look, the world is full of people who will take advantage of your goodness, who will exploit your trust, who will mistake your kindness for weakness and your mercy for cowardice. And if you go through life assuming everyone operates the way you do, you're going to get hurt, badly and repeatedly. Now, he wasn't saying you should be a terrible person. That's a common misreading of his work. He was saying you need to understand reality as it is, not as you wish it were. You need to see people clearly, including their capacity for selfishness and cruelty and betrayal, not because everyone is terrible, but because enough people are opportunistic enough of the time that ignoring this reality is naive and dangerous. Think about the last time someone let you down, really let you down. Maybe it was a friend who abandoned you when you needed support, or a colleague who took credit for your work, or a partner who promised to change and didn't. In the aftermath, you probably felt confused. You probably thought you had an understanding, an unspoken contract about how you'd treat each other. And they violated it, and part of what hurts is the betrayal itself, but part of what hurts, maybe the deeper part, is the realization that the understanding you thought you had might never have existed at all. You were playing by one set of rules while they were playing by another, and you didn't even realize you were in different games. Machiavelli would say that's on you, not in a mean way, but in an honest one. He'd say you made a decision based on how you wanted the world to be rather than how it is, and that's a recipe for suffering. Your mind does this constantly, builds models of other people that are really just projections of yourself or idealized versions of who you want them to be. And then reality intrudes, reveals the gap between your model and the actual person, and you feel betrayed even though nobody actually promised to be who you imagined they were. This is another way your mind makes what looks like stupid decisions. It operates on assumptions that feel true but aren't, and it resists updating those assumptions even when evidence piles up, because changing your model of someone means grieving the loss of who you thought they were, and that grief is painful enough that your mind will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid it. There's another pattern Machiavelli identified that's worth sitting with for a moment. He noticed that people have an almost supernatural ability to believe what they want to believe, regardless of evidence. He watched leaders ignore warnings from advisors because the warnings contradicted what they wanted to do anyway. He watched cities ignore signs of impending invasion because acknowledging the threat would require difficult preparations and sacrifices. He watched individuals convince themselves of the most absurd things because the alternative was admitting something uncomfortable about themselves or their situation. And he came to understand that human reason, which we think of as this tool for discovering truth, is actually much better at constructing justifications for what we've already decided. We don't think our way to conclusions. We feel our way there, and then we build elaborate logical structures to make our feelings look like thoughts. Your mind will always like making stupid decisions. That's not going to change. But you don't have to go along with it every single time. You can develop a kind of friendly skepticism toward your own thoughts, a habit of questioning your certainties, a willingness to look at uncomfortable truths. You can build practices that help you see more clearly, whether that's journaling to examine your own thinking, seeking out perspectives that contradict your own, or simply getting better at noticing when you're feeling defensive or overly confident or unreasonably certain. These aren't magic solutions. You'll still make plenty of stupid decisions. But maybe, just maybe, you'll make a few less than you would have otherwise. And over a lifetime, those few decisions might make all the difference. If this exploration of why your mind works against you resonated with you, if you found yourself recognizing these patterns in your own life, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives